Dr. Jessica Miller stood at the viewport of the diplomatic shuttle, watching as Nexus Prime's crystalline surface grew ever larger. The planet's iridescent cities sparkled like scattered diamonds across continents of pure quartz, their spires reaching up through the atmosphere as if trying to pierce the stars themselves. Her reflection showed a woman in her mid-30s, wearing the crisp blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun that did nothing to hide the determined set of her jaw. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice belonged to her Scatheri escort, Lord Vexthor, his crystalline body pulsing with bands of light that she'd learned indicated patronizing amusement. Few lesser species ever witness our capital world in person. You should feel honored. Jessica bit back the retort that burned on her tongue. 6 months of intensive diplomatic training hadn't prepared her for the sheer arrogance of the Scatheri. Every conversation dripped with condescension. Every gesture reminded humans of their proper place in the galaxy's hierarchy. The shuttle banked sharply, beginning its descent toward the Imperial Reception Plaza. Through the viewport, Jessica could see thousands of Scatheri gathered to witness her arrival. Their crystalline bodies formed a living kaleidoscope of light and color, each being's status displayed through complex patterns that rippled across their transparent forms. Remember, Ambassador Miller, Lord Vexthor continued, his own body gleaming with the royal purple hues of the noble caste, do not attempt to touch any of my kind. Your organic impurities would be most distressing to them. Of course, Lord Vexthor, Jessica replied, keeping her voice steady despite her rising irritation. Though I admit I'm curious, how do Scatheri greet each other if physical contact is forbidden? The crystalline being's face fractured into what she'd learned was their equivalent of a condescending smile. We resonate, Ambassador. Our bodies sing to each other in frequencies your primitive auditory system cannot perceive. It is a pure greeting, unsullied by crude physical interaction. The shuttle touched down with perfect precision on a landing pad that looked like it had been carved from a single massive diamond. As the door opened, Jessica was struck by a wall of sound, thousands of Scatheri bodies humming in harmony, creating a symphony that, despite Vexthor's claims, she could very much hear. The effect was beautiful, but somehow hollow, like wind through empty crystal caves. She stepped onto the landing pad, her heels clicking against the transparent surface. The assembled crowd fell silent, their crystalline bodies dimming slightly as if to show their disapproval of her organic presence. At the far end of the plaza stood the Imperial Council, their massive forms towering 3 times her height, their bodies swirling with complex patterns of light that marked them as the galaxy's self-proclaimed supreme beings. The Council Patriarch's voice boomed across the plaza, each word accompanied by pulses of light that rippled through his crystalline form. We welcome Earth's representative to Nexus Prime. May your presence here mark the beginning of humanity's elevation from its current primitive state. Jessica forced herself to bow, exactly 30 degrees as protocol demanded. When she straightened, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Near the edge of the plaza, partially hidden behind the crystalline crowd, stood a group of beings from other lesser species. Their bodies bore the dull gray crystals of servitude, their eyes vacant, their movements mechanical. They weren't allies or servants of the Empire. They were slaves, their bodies and minds partially crystallized to ensure obedience. As the ceremony continued, Jessica maintained her diplomatic smile, but her mind was racing. The reports she'd read, the rumors she dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theories, they were all true. The Scatheri Empire wasn't offering humanity protection. They were laying the groundwork for our complete subjugation. She just hoped she could find a way to warn Earth before it was too late. The deep hum of crystal against crystal followed Dr. Jessica Miller as she walked through the twisting corridors of the Imperial Palace. After 3 weeks on Nexus Prime, she'd learned to hate that sound. It reminded her of funeral bells, deep and resonant, marking the slow death of free will across the galaxy. Her quarters, while luxurious by human standards, felt like a beautiful cage. The walls pulsed with soft light, monitoring her every movement. The Scatheri called it protective observation. Jessica called it what it was: surveillance. A soft chime announced the arrival of her assigned attendant, Menxrel, a younger Scatheri whose crystal form showed hairline fractures, imperfections that had relegated them to serving lesser beings. Ambassador Miller, Menxrel hummed, their form dimming to show appropriate subservience. The Imperial Council requests your presence at tonight's Harmony ceremony. They believe witnessing proper resonance might help elevate your species' understanding. Jessica nodded, noting how Menxrel kept the regulation 5 feet of distance between them. Thank you, Menxrel. Though I'm curious, have you ever touched another being? Before she gestured to the fractures. The young Scatheri's light patterns shifted rapidly. Fear, she'd learned to recognize. Such questions are not appropriate, Ambassador. I must attend to other duties. They turned to leave, but not before Jessica caught a glimpse of something in their fractured surface: longing. Later that evening, as she followed the twisting pathway to the ceremonial chamber, Jessica noticed a servant from the Vexi species, one of the Empire's first protectorates, stumble and brush against a Scatheri noble. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. The noble's crystal body flared with blinding light. Contamination. This lesser being dares defile our purity. Guards materialized instantly, their forms blazing with aggressive patterns. The Vexi, a gentle arthropoid species, chittered in terror. Please, Great One. It was an accident. Their plea cut off as crystalline energy surged from the guards, beginning the purification process. Jessica watched, unable to intervene, as crystal formations began growing across the servant's exoskeleton. Within moments, the once living being had become a crystalline statue, their last moment of terror preserved perfectly in transparent mineral. A necessary example, came a voice behind her. Jessica turned to find Lord Vexthor, his noble form radiating smugness. The lesser races must learn their place. Touch is a privilege reserved for the pure. Yet you touched me on the shuttle, Jessica observed carefully, when you guided me to my seat. Vexthor's patterns flickered with momentary confusion before settling into superiority. Different circumstances, Ambassador. We of the noble caste have special dispensation when handling valuable specimens. Now come, the ceremony awaits. The ceremonial chamber stretched a mile high, its faceted walls amplifying the resonant hum of thousands of Scatheri. As the harmony ceremony began, Jessica noticed movement in a shadowed alcove. A hooded figure beckoned urgently. Making sure all eyes were focused on the ceremony, Jessica slipped away from her assigned position. In the alcove, she found herself facing another Vexi, this one wearing the crystals of a scholarly caste. Ambassador Miller, the alien whispered, mandibles clicking softly, I am Professor Zix. What you witnessed today, it is only the beginning. The Empire's true plans for humanity are far worse. The crystallization chambers, Jessica breathed. They're real. Zix's compound eyes reflected the ceremony's lights, real and nearly operational. But there is resistance. Many of us, even some young Scatheri like your attendant Menxrel, see the Empire's cruelty for what it is. We need humanity's help before. A sudden shift in the ceremony's resonance made Zix vanish into the shadows. Jessica returned to her position, just as Lord Vexthor turned to check on her, his crystalline face showing no sign that he'd noticed her absence. But as the ceremony's haunting tones washed over her, Jessica's mind raced. She'd found allies, but she'd also glimpsed the true horror awaiting humanity if they remained the Empire's protectorate. The question was, what could one human ambassador do against an empire built on millennia of crystalline certainty? The answer, though she didn't know it yet, would come down to a single, impossible touch. Dr. Jessica Miller's hands trembled as she decoded the encrypted message on her quantum tablet. The holographic text cast an eerie blue glow across her face as she read the coordinates Professor Zix had sent. After 2 months of clandestine meetings and whispered warnings, she finally had proof of the Empire's true intentions. The maintenance tunnels beneath the Lesser Quarter. The message read, "Midnight. Bring your environmental suit. What will show you cannot be unseen." The service corridors wound deep beneath the Crystal City like veins of darkness in an otherwise perfect gem. Jessica's magnetic boots clicked softly against the metallic floor, one of the few surfaces on Nexus Prime not made of crystal. Her guide, a crystallized Vexi named Hutrix, moved silently ahead, their partially transformed body allowing them to pass routine security scans. The Empire keeps their greatest sins in the deepest shadows, Hutrix whispered, mandibles clicking softly. Even most Scatheri don't know what happens down here. They emerged onto an observation platform overlooking an immense chamber. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Below them stretched a vast factory floor, where massive crystalline machines hummed with terrible purpose. Conveyor belts carried thousands of crystallized bodies, members of various species frozen in poses of terror or supplication. "These are the rejected specimens," Trix explained, their compound eyes reflecting the horrible scene. "The ones whose crystallization was imperfect. The successful conversions become loyal servants. The failures become building materials." Jessica activated her tablet's camera, documenting everything. "But why show me this? What does it have to do with?" She stopped as a new hologram flickered to life on the factory floor, displaying 3 familiar worlds. Human colony worlds. New Eden, Nova Prime, and Haven's Rest. Came a new voice. Professor Zix emerged from the shadows, clutching a data crystal. "The Empire calls it the Perfection Protocol. They've built orbital crystallization chambers above each colony. When activated, they'll transform every organic being on the surface into crystalline servants." Jessica's mind raced through the implications. The population of those colonies, that's over 12 million people. The largest conversion attempt in Imperial history, Zix confirmed. "They believe humanity's adaptability makes us perfect candidates. If successful, Earth will be next." The journey back to the surface passed in a blur. By morning, Jessica had compiled all the evidence into a formal presentation for the Imperial Council. She refused to believe they'd condone such atrocity if confronted with the truth. The council chamber's vast dome amplified every sound as Jessica made her case. Her voice remained steady as she projected images of the factory, the crystallization chambers, the classified documents proving the Empire's plans. The council patriarch's response was a laugh that sent ripples of light cascading through his crystalline form. "My dear Ambassador Miller, you misunderstand. This is a gift to your species." "A gift?" Jessica's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're planning to transform millions of humans into crystalline slaves." "Not slaves. Elevated beings," the patriarch corrected, his tone dripping with patronizing amusement. "Your organic form is so limiting. We offer perfection, eternity, unity with the Empire's greater purpose." He descended from his throne, towering over her. In a gesture that broke every protocol about touch, he patted her head like a child. "Your species' resistance to beneficial change is why you need our guidance. The Perfection Protocol begins in 1 standard week. I suggest you focus on preparing your people for their glorious ascension." Jessica stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the casual way they dismissed humanity's right to exist. Around her, the council members had already moved on to other matters, their crystalline forms humming with self-satisfied resonance. As guards escorted her from the chamber, she caught sight of Mexerel watching from a side corridor, their fractured form dimmed with what might have been sympathy, or perhaps a warning. The Empire had shown its true face. Now Jessica had to decide if one human ambassador could find a way to shatter their perfect crystalline world before humanity became just another set of frozen statues in their vast collection. The grand ceremonial hall blazed with crystalline light as Dr. Jessica Miller watched her fellow human diplomats being herded onto the display floor. Her nails dug into her palms, drawing blood as she fought to maintain her composure. 3 days had passed since the Council's dismissal of her evidence, and now they had demanded Earth's entire diplomatic corps participate in the millennia-old ceremony of submission. Behold, the Council Patriarch's voice resonated through the hall as our newest protectorate species learns its proper place in the grand design. The floor beneath the human diplomats began to glow with swirling patterns of luminescent crystal dust. Ambassador Chen from the Asian Consortium was the first to be forced down, his dignified bearing crumbling as crystalline energy pressed him to his hands and knees. One by one, Earth's representatives fell into the same position. "You see, Ambassador Miller," Lord Vexthor whispered from beside her, his crystalline form pulsing with amusement, "how naturally your kind assumes the posture of servitude. The dust they crawl through will begin the preliminary crystallization process, a gentle introduction to their coming perfection." Jessica spotted Anxrel among the servants, their fractured form dimmed almost to darkness. The young Sktheri couldn't meet her eyes. Near them stood Professor Zix and Cutrix, forced to attend as representatives of successfully elevated species. "Now crawl," the Patriarch commanded. "Show us the dance of the lesser beings." The crystal dust clung to her colleagues as they were forced to crawl in elaborate patterns across the floor. Ambassador Chen's silver hair now sparkled with crystalline fragments. Maria Gonzalez, Earth's most decorated xenobiologist, left trails of light as she moved, her tears turning to crystal as they fell. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The Patriarch's voice carried a note of genuine pleasure. "See how the crystallization begins. Within hours, these preliminary traces will spread through their limbic systems, making them so much more compliant." Jessica's hand brushed the data crystal hidden in her pocket, her last transmission to Earth, warning them of the coming attack. But she knew it was already too late for the colonies. The orbital chambers were charging up, their activation sequence already begun. And now, the Patriarch continued, Ambassador Miller will join her fellow humans in demonstrating their species' natural state. Jessica felt the crystal energy trying to force her down, but she planted her feet. The pressure increased, sending shots of pain through her body. Still, she remained standing. Fascinating resistance, the Patriarch mused, descending from his throne. But ultimately futile. Like all lesser beings, you will kneel, you will crawl, you will be perfected. He towered over her, his crystalline form refracting the light into rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so terrible. With casual cruelty, he reached down and flicked her forehead, breaking his own sacred touch taboo to demonstrate her worthlessness. "Even now, you don't understand," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Your species is barely more than clever animals. Your resistance is not noble. It is merely evidence of your need for elevation. Watch as I demonstrate proper behavior to this slow learner." The crystal energy intensified, driving Jessica to one knee. Around her, her colleagues continued their forced dance, the crystal dust spreading further across their bodies. Ambassador Chen's movements were becoming jerky, mechanical, as the crystallization reached his nervous system. The Patriarch turned to address the assembled crowd. "Let this be a lesson to all lesser species. Resistance to elevation is merely—" He never finished the sentence. In that moment, watching her proud colleagues reduced to crawling puppets, something broke inside Dr. Jessica Miller. Years of diplomatic training, careful protocol, and political maneuvering fell away. She rose from her knee, diplomatic smile still fixed perfectly in place, and decided that sometimes the only proper response to imperial arrogance was a perfectly delivered human bitch slap. Time seemed to slow as Dr. Jessica Miller took that first step toward the Council Patriarch. The crystalline floor sang beneath her feet, each click of her heels echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. Her diplomatic smile never wavered, even as her right hand tingled with anticipation. The Patriarch didn't move. The concept of a lesser being approaching him with hostile intent was so foreign that his crystalline mind couldn't process it. His faceted eyes swept over her with the same dismissive glance one might give an amusing pet. "Observe," he announced to the crowd, "how even now she seeks guidance from her betters. This primitive instinct to approach authority figures will serve humanity well in their elevated state." Behind her, Jessica could hear the scraping sounds of her colleagues, still forced to crawl through the crystallizing dust. Ambassador Chen's breathing had become mechanical, rhythmic, as crystal formations spread across his skin. Maria Gonzalez had stopped crying. Her tears had crystallized her tear ducts shut. 10 steps from the throne now. The guards didn't move to stop her. Why would they? No lesser being had ever dared to touch a council member, let alone the patriarch himself. It was meant to be physically impossible, prevented by the very laws of nature as the Scatheri understood them. "Perhaps," the patriarch continued, "we should display this one in the Hall of Specimens after her elevation, a reminder of humanity's quaint resistance to perfection." 5 steps. Jessica caught sight of Professor Zix in the crowd, the Vekshi's compound eyes wide with realization. Beside them, Xrel's fractured form blazed briefly with hope, the young Scatheri understanding what was about to happen. 3 steps. Lord Vexthor finally sensed something was wrong. "Ambassador Miller," he started, "return to your designated." 2 steps. The patriarch looked down at her, still amused. "Do you wish to kneel closer to glory, little human? I shall permit it, as a sign of our magnanimous." 1 step. Jessica's diplomatic smile widened just a fraction. The sound of her palm, connecting with the patriarch's crystalline face, echoed like a thunderclap through the chamber. The perfect geometric angles of his features distorted for just a moment under the impact. A small spider web of cracks appeared on his right cheek, and there, perfectly outlined in spreading fracture lines, was the red imprint of a human hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ever-present crystalline hum of the city seemed to stop. The patriarch raised his hand to his cheek, his faceted eyes wide with disbelief. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its resonant authority. This is impossible." Jessica flexed her stinging hand, satisfaction coursing through her. "Funny thing about humans," she said, her voice carrying in the dead silence. "We tend to do a lot of impossible things, especially when you tell us we can't." The crowd erupted in chaos. Lesser species began shouting, cheering, their voices drowning out the Scatheri's harmonic attempts to restore order. The crystal dust on the floor swirled up in clouds as Earth's diplomats rose to their feet, the patriarch's shock having broken his hold over them. You struck me," the patriarch stammered, his body's light patterns strobing with confusion and rage. "No lesser being can ever." "Then I guess we're not as lesser as you thought," Jessica replied. She turned to face the crowd, holding up her reddened palm like a badge of honor. "The Empire bleeds, my friends. Their crystal bodies can be marked. Their perfect hierarchy can be broken. They are not gods. They're just bullies who've gone unchallenged for too long." As guards finally rushed forward to seize her, Jessica caught sight of Xrel and Professor Zix slipping away through a side door, no doubt to spread word of what they'd witnessed. The young Scatheri's fractured form blazed with newfound purpose, while the Vekshi's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. The revolution wouldn't happen immediately, but in that moment, watching the patriarch's hand repeatedly touch the mark she'd left on his face, Jessica knew the Empire's days of absolute power were over. Sometimes all it took to shatter an empire's worth of crystalline certainty was 5 fingers and the audacity to use them. The video spread through the Empire's crystalline networks like wildfire. No matter how many times the Imperial Guard deleted it, the footage reappeared, a human hand striking crystalline divinity, leaving its mark upon the supposedly untouchable. Dr. Jessica Miller sat in her detention cell, its transparent walls refracting rainbow patterns across her face. Outside, she could hear the growing chaos as news of her action spread. The guards had long since stopped trying to prevent her from hearing the reports. Another uprising on Vector Prime, one guard muttered to another. The Seclith workers are refusing to resonate with their overseers. They're just touching things. Everything. Everyone. Madness on Cristellus 3. Another reported. The younger nobles are deliberately fracturing their own forms in protest. They're calling it the Miller pattern. Jessica smiled, remembering Exral's fractured form. Those imperfections weren't signs of weakness. They were badges of resistance, proof that even the Scatheri themselves were beginning to question their society's rigid structure. The cell's entrance crystallized, forming into the imposing shape of Lord Vexthor. His usual smug resonance had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "Do you understand what you've done?" he demanded. 3,000 years of perfect harmony, shattered by one primitive gesture. Harmony. Jessica stood, noting how he flinched back despite the cell's barrier. "You mean oppression. Fear. The crystallization of free will itself. The council chambers are in chaos," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The patriarch hasn't emerged since the incident. The mark won't fade. We've tried everything, but your handprint remains, mocking our very existence." Through the crystalline walls, Jessica watched a group of young Scatheri nobles hurry past. Their forms bore deliberate fractures, each carrying the same pattern, a five-fingered mark self-inflicted as a symbol of solidarity. "You know what's really fascinating?" Jessica leaned closer to the wall, making Vexthor step back again. "Your whole society is based on the idea that touch is sacred, reserved for the pure. But you nobles broke that taboo countless times when it suited you, touching us lesser beings to show dominance, to prove we were beneath your laws." A commotion erupted in the corridor. Professor Zix had been captured, caught distributing copies of the slap footage in the lesser quarter. The Vexi scientists' mandibles clicked rapidly as they were dragged past. "Worth it," Zix called out upon seeing Jessica. "The colonies are rising. The orbital chambers crews are in revolt. They're saying if a human could mark the patriarch, then everything else we were taught about our limitations must be lies too." The detention center's crystalline structure suddenly hummed with alarm frequencies. On every view screen, the footage played again. The human ambassadors measured steps, the perfect diplomatic smile, the crack of flesh meeting crystal that shattered millennia of carefully constructed mythology. "The perfection protocol," Vexthor said quietly. "It was supposed to begin today, but the technicians are refusing to activate the chambers. They're saying they won't enforce perfection through touch when their leaders showed touch means nothing." Jessica's cell wall rippled, displaying news feeds from across the Empire. On a dozen worlds, crystallized servants were breaking their programming simply by reaching out and touching their betters. The Scatheri's own propaganda network, designed to broadcast their superiority, now carried proof of their hypocrisy to every corner of their domain. "Your empire made a crucial mistake," Jessica said, watching the revolution unfold. "You built your entire civilization on the idea that you were untouchable. But the moment that illusion cracked, everything else began to shatter." Outside her cell, another group of young nobles rushed past, their fractured forms glittering with newfound purpose. The sound of their resonance had changed, no longer the perfect harmony of oppression, but a wild breaking music that sang of change. The revolution had begun with a single touch, but it would end with millions of hands reaching out to shatter the crystal cage that had imprisoned them for so long. The imperial palace shook with the resonance of a billion voices raised in defiance. 7 days had passed since the slap, and the empire's perfect crystalline order had dissolved into beautiful chaos. Dr. Jessica Miller watched from her cell as another section of the palace transformed into clouded, imperfect crystal, the physical manifestation of changing minds. "They're calling it the Freedom's Touch movement," Mamxrel whispered through the cell's communication crystal. The young Scatheri's fractured form now bore proud patterns similar to Jessica's handprint. "Every hour, more of us choose to break our perfect forms. The old ones can't understand it. They keep trying to resonate control back into us. But A thunderous crack interrupted them as another crystal spire collapsed in the distance. The sound of liberation, Jessica thought, watching the crystalline dust scatter in the wind. Ambassador Miller. Professor Zix's voice crackled through the same crystal, their mandibles clicking with excitement. The orbital chambers above the human colonies, they're being dismantled. The maintenance crews aren't just refusing to operate them. They're taking them apart piece by piece. The news feeds still functioning showed scenes of revolution across the Empire. On Vector Prime, crystallized servants simply walked away from their posts, their programming shattered by the realization that divinity could be marked by mortal hands. The Seklith workers on Manufacturing World 6 had turned the Empire's own crystallization technology against the Overseer's chambers, transforming them into public monuments to resistance. Lord Vexthor appeared outside her cell, his once perfect form now showing stress fractures. "The Council demands your presence," he said, his resonance stripped of its former arrogance. They wish to negotiate. The Council chamber looked nothing like it had a week ago. The perfect geometric patterns were corrupted with countless handprints, marks left by every species that had found the courage to touch what was supposed to be untouchable. The Patriarch still sat upon his throne, but the mark of Jessica's hand remained on his face, a beacon that drew every eye. "Do you see what you've done?" The Patriarch's voice had lost its harmonious overtones. 3,000 years of perfect order, reduced to this chaos. Jessica surveyed the chamber, noting the young nobles with their proud fractures, the former servants standing tall, the representatives of a dozen species no longer cowering in the presence of their betters. "I see freedom," she replied. "I see people choosing their own path instead of following your forced harmony. I see the natural order of things. Messy, imperfect, but real." A commotion at the chamber's entrance drew their attention. Ambassador Chen entered, his partially crystallized form glittering as he walked, not crawled, to Jessica's side. Behind him came Maria Gonzalez, the crystallization in her tears now formed into a pattern of defiance around her eyes. "The human colonies are secure," Chen reported, his voice strong despite the crystal threading through his vocal cords. "And Earth sends its regards. They've begun distributing the footage to every corner of known space. Your perfect empire has become a symbol of resistance to oppression everywhere." The Patriarch's form dimmed as he slumped in his throne. "What do you want? How do we stop this madness?" "You don't," Jessica said simply. "You can't stop people from reaching out to touch each other, to connect, to leave their mark on the universe. You can either accept that your time of absolute power is over, or you can watch your empire shatter completely." Through the chamber's windows, she could see the sun setting on Nexus Prime, its light catching on the newly imperfect crystals of the city. The fractured surfaces no longer reflected a single, pure radiance, but instead cast countless rainbow patterns across the landscape, each one unique, each one beautiful in its own way. The revolution hadn't come with armies or weapons. It had come with open hands and the courage to reach out and touch the foundations of power itself. As darkness fell on the Empire's capital, the crystal spires sang with a new resonance, the sound of freedom spreading at the speed of light through the galaxy's biggest communications network. 1 year after the slap, Dr. Jessica Miller stood at the podium in the transformed council chamber, now renamed the Hall of Equal Voices. The crystalline walls, once perfect and uniform, now bore the marks and patterns of 100 species, each touch adding to the living history of the revolution. "The Galactic Cooperative," she announced to the assembled representatives, "is no longer just a dream. Today we formalize what began with a single act of defiance, a true union of species where no one claims divine right or absolute authority." The chamber had changed dramatically. Where the Patriarch's throne once dominated, now stood a circular table of intentionally imperfect crystal. Around it sat delegates from every former imperial world. Humans, Vexshi, Seklith, and even young Scatheri who had chosen to fracture their perfect forms. Nexrel, now the lead representative of the Reformed Scatheri movement, rose to speak. Their fractured form gleamed with pride. We keep the marks of the revolution not as symbols of shame, but as reminders. Every imperfection tells a story of freedom. Every crack speaks of change. Professor Zix clicked their mandibles in agreement. The HFY scientist had become a leading voice in the new government, their compound eyes reflecting the rainbow light from the chamber's walls. The crystallization chambers have been repurposed. What once enforced uniformity now powers our cities, their energy redirected to serve all species equally. In the public gallery, Lord Vexthor watched quietly. Like many of the old guard, he had chosen to retain his perfect form. But now it marked him as a relic of the past, rather than a symbol of authority. The former nobles had been granted amnesty in exchange for their cooperation in dismantling the Empire's oppressive systems. The human colonies send their regards, Ambassador Chen announced. The crystal patterns in his skin now formed into elegant designs of his own choosing. New Eden, Nova Prime, and Haven's Rest had become centers of cultural exchange. Former imperial technology, freed from its oppressive purpose, has enabled unprecedented advancement in medicine, science, and interspecies cooperation. Maria Gonzalez, her crystalline tears now fashioned into decorative patterns that enhanced her expressions rather than hiding them, presented the scientific reports. We've discovered that controlled voluntary crystallization can facilitate communication between species. What was once forced upon us has become a tool for understanding. Jessica smiled as she watched her former captors and newfound allies working together. The patriarch's handprint-marked face had become a symbol of revolution across the galaxy, appearing in art, literature, and song. He had chosen exile, unable to adapt to a world where touch was no longer sacred but freely given. But the greatest change, she continued her address, isn't in our laws or technologies. It's in how we see each other. The Empire built its power on artificial barriers, untouchable divinity, perfect crystalline forms, rigid hierarchies. They forgot that the universe itself is built on connection, on particles and forces reaching out to touch each other across the vast depths of space. The chamber's new acoustics carried her voice clearly, without the overwhelming resonance of the old imperial harmonics. Outside, the city of Nexus Prime glittered in the sunlight, its spires now a celebration of diversity rather than uniformity. Former slave quarters had been transformed into cultural centers, where species freely shared their art, music, and traditions. Let today be remembered not as the end of an empire, Jessica concluded, but as the beginning of something far more precious, a galaxy where every being has the right to reach out, to touch, to leave their mark upon existence itself. We keep our imperfections, our differences, our unique patterns, for it is in these variations that true harmony is found. As if in response, the chamber's crystals began to sing, not with the forced resonance of imperial control, but with the complex, beautiful harmonies of countless voices choosing to join together in song. The revolution that began with a slap had ended in an embrace, transforming a crystal prison into a shimmering reflection of freedom's endless possibilities.